Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome to episode 2 in our tutorial of Captain C, the 2021 war game from Legion Wargames covering combat in the Age of Sail, specifically focusing on the engagements with the American frigates from 1799 to 1815. Today, in this episode, we're going to concentrate on firing, we're going to look at straining, then we're going to also look at the end of turn housekeeping. And by the time we're done with this episode, between episodes 1 and 2, we should have covered most of the core mechanics in the game. Let's jump right in and get started. Okay, so let's jump back in. I'm excited to see how the combat portion of this tutorial works out. A couple of little housekeeping things as we start out. I'm going to divide this video up into chapters, so you can use the red horizontal line on the bottom of the YouTube navigation pane to select the exact spot in the video that you want to learn about. So if you're coming back to this video later and say, gosh, I just want to learn how to do defensive dice, you should be able to use that chapter to jump right into that one part of the video instead of having to fumble your way all the way through it looking for something. So I'm hoping that this can serve as a resource for kind of jumping in and jumping out as you're playing as well. Lastly, the first video, so far it's looking pretty good. The designer, Mike Nagel, was extremely kind to look through the video to check for errors and things like that. And there was just one observation that he had, that it turned out that worked out okay. So it looks like the first video, at the very least, has a minimal number of errors in it, if any at all. So I'm pretty happy with that. I was kind of considered as a first shot to do really a full tutorial type video on the channel. So I thought there were going to be hundreds of errors. And the last thing you want is a tutorial video that has a lot of errors in it. So I'm relieved to hear that I think things have gone pretty well. And I'm hopeful that this second part of the tutorial will likewise have at least a minimal amount of errors in it. Now, errors I think are going to be part of it, but again, I will go in and have a known errors section in the video description, and I'll keep that up to date as people mention things. So if we do have to make any modifications, check in the description for known errors, and it should be highlighted what we should have done and what we would have done to kind of correct that error. So with that being said, I think it's time to jump in and get started. To set the stage again, we have the Endymion on the left chasing the president on the right. This is a battle that happened in January of 1815 between the British Endymion and the US president. And we have gone through, setting up our first turn. We've moved through the first turn to the point where we hit the first activation that had either an activation marker on it or a reloading marker on it. And that means when you hit that, that's an active impulse. And in that case, you're going to do a couple things. One is select maneuvers, and the other is combat. Those are generally the two things you're doing. You could also end it with a grapple if the ships were close to each other, but that obviously isn't the case now. So for most of what we're going to see in this tutorial and this series, we're going to see maneuvering and then firing if ships want to fire. With that being said, the Endymion, of course, maneuvered by wearing to starboard, and now it can bear its port broadsides on the president, and it has men on those, manning those guns. They're all set to fire. The president, however, cannot do that. It hasn't been able to maneuver yet. It's going to turn up into the wind. It's going to take a longer time to do that, and it's also at fighting sails, which means it's going to be slower. So the president is still kind of heading straight to the east here, kind of at a broad reach, and it's going to take the broadside of the Endymion. The president, however, will be able to fire its stern chasers at the Endymion. So let's go in now and let's resolve this combat. Okay, for firing here, again, we are in the impulse activation. The first part of the impulse activation was the maneuvering, which we've done. Second part is reloading, which doesn't apply here because everybody's already fully reloaded. The third part is conducting fire combat. And the fourth part, again, is grappling, which we won't do because the ships aren't in the same square. So the last part of this impulse that we need to take care of is conducting fire combat. For conducting fire combat, the non-initiative player declares first whether they're going to fire. So this, in case, is the Endymion, because the president has the initiative. The Endymion is, of course, electing to fire its broadside on the port side at the president. The president has the option now to declare what it's going to do. It's going to fire its stern chasers at the Endymion. The firing happens simultaneously. Of course, you resolve it sequentially, but the damage is assessed simultaneously. So we're going to do one, then the other. Put the damage in sequentially as well, but assume that, yes, we understand that the damage is happening simultaneously. So none of the damage, if we resolve the Endymion first and it hit the president, none of the damage on the president would impact this impulse's firing by the president on the Endymion. Let's resolve the President firing its chasers at the Endymion. To do that, let's just take a quick look at the ship mat to understand whether the President can fire them and what kind of things you're looking for to make sure it has capacity to fire its chasers. So let's just take a quick look to check to see if the President has the capacity to fire chasers. And you get basically 2 dice rolls. Each shot is going to be 1 die roll. And in order to fire both of them, you have to have at least 1 point of capacity left in each side of the ship that's going to fire. So the starboard aft broadside has full points. The port aft broadside has full points. So in this case, 2 points of chasers can fire. 1 for this side, 1 for this side. If this side were reduced to 0, the President could only fire 1 chaser. So it can fire 2. Now you might say, well, wait a second, you don't have crew assigned to the starboard the starboard broadside, the starboard aft broadside. You don't need points assigned to crew in order to be able to fire the chasers. As long as there's capacity to fire, they can fire. So the President's going to fire 2 points worth of chasers. Let's go resolve that attack. So let's come in now and fire the chasers. We have to make sure the range is okay. Chasers have a range of 24, and to calculate firing range, we use the advance mechanic of the movement to determine the points of range that are appropriate here. So crossing a side costs 2 points, and so the range here is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. If the Endymion were here, you count 2 points for a side and 3 points for a corner. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 11 would be the range here. In this case, our range is 12, so plenty of range for the President to fire at. The chasers are well within range. The chasers are a very easy combat roll. All you have to do with the chaser, there's no die roll modifications. You're looking for a 6 each time you fire them. And we have 2 chances, so we're going to fire both the port and the starboard side chasers. We need 6s to hit. And if you get a hit for each one of your hits, you simply subtract 1 point of rigging damage from the Endymion. Again, looking for 6s. We got 1 6, second I missed, and a 1. So the President has successfully hit the Endymion with 1 of its chasers. Let's go mark that damage on the Endymion ship mat. So let's subtract the rigging damage from the Endymion. It was at 12 points. It's had 1 point of damage, so it drops down to 11 points now. Now again, this would be considered to happen simultaneously, so nothing that happens in the damage that we're putting onto the Endymion ship mat would impact its current firing. So let's now go and fire the Endymion's broadside, a much more deadly attack at the President. Just to tidy things up, there's one more thing we need to do, which is we need to reload the stern chasers. And this matters on the quality of the crew, how long it takes to reload, and the type of shot you're firing. Because the chasers fire round shot, we're just going to, there is no modifications or delay to this. We're going to look at the crew quality, and it takes 6 impulses to reload for a crack crew, 9 for an average, or 12 for a green. So because the President's crew is crack quality, it's going to take 6 impulses to reload. We're currently in the 6th one, so 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, I've just taken the stern chaser's kind of marker off the back of the mat and put it on here. We'll put it back on the mat when it's reloaded. So on the 12th impulse, the stern chasers of the President will reload. Let's have the Endymion fire its broadside now at the President and see what happens here. First up, we need to determine the firing section, so let's go take a look at the ship mat to see what we do. The Endymion's port cannons are facing the President, so those are the ones that have to fire the broadside. So we are going to check to make sure that points are assigned, and there are points assigned at full capacity. Whoops, flying all over the place. So the President can fire all its cannons on its port side and all its cannons on its port side, both forward and aft. We mentioned in the previous video that this is the cannon capacity. The first number being the long-range cannons of 5, the second number being the carronades. Carronades have a range of 6. And we know from just calculating the President's chaser fire that the range currently is 12. So the Endymion cannot fire its carronades. It can only fire its long cannons. It's going to fire 5 long cannons from the forward port and 5 long cannons from the port aft. So it's got a total of 10 cannons firing in this attack. So to determine the range, again, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Each time you cross a side in calculating range, you count 2. Each time you cross a corner, you count 3. So we know the range is currently 12. And that's actually going to be important when we calculate defensive dice, because we'll see what happens here now. So We've determined the range, we've identified the firing sections. Now we have to determine whether it's rake status. And rake is basically when one ship fires along another ship in a perfectly perpendicular manner. Now you might say, wait a second, isn't this true? Because the Endymion is firing right across the back of the president. But it's not a rake because the position of the Endymion is angled. It would have to be this way. This would be a rake on the president, and this is not a rake. Now, just to kind of show what a rake is like in if the ships were in this other angle here, we'll just move them here. So if the ships were like this, if the ships were like this, the question is, would this be a rake? On the diagonal, you have to be exactly in the diagonal square and perpendicular to the ship. So if the president were here, Endymion would here, this would be a rake. This would not be a rake because the Endymion isn't perfectly perpendicular to the president. Likewise, on this other row, if you would, if the Endymion is facing towards the president and perfectly perpendicular on these diagonal shots, this would also be a rake. So it's coming this way, crossing the president this way at a perfectly perpendicular angle. So in these kind of non-options to get to a perfectly perpendicular, if you're moving that way. If it were this way and the Endymion were firing, it is not a rake because the Endymion isn't moving towards that rake position when it fires. So all the way back here now, if we put them back in their original positions, that takes care of determining rake and how to do it. The Endymion does not have a rake. Now, one of the questions I was wondering about, and I'm not 100% sure here, is which side of the ship of the president would the Endymion hit? And because only on a rake do you hit fully on the stern, I'm assuming because the president is moving, the Endymion is moving to this side of the rake, so it was perfectly behind it. Now it's sliding here, that we're going to calculate the damage, if there is any, on the starboard side. I'm not 100% sure of that, but that's my assumption with this one, and we'll just kind of go with that. So the next thing that the Endymion has to do, it has to decide whether it's going to fire high or fire low. We're going to fire low with both sections. We could fire high with one section and low with the other, and then calculate both as two different attacks. But we're going, and then you would divide the defensive dice in half. But we're going to fire everything low at the president. So it's all going to be resolved, all 10 cannon shots resolved in one attack. Now, as the Endymion and the president have determined to fire, we also can add cards to the firing. And the Endymion actually has a great card to play, to be this. A non-initiative player plays cards first on a firing thing. So the Endymion is going to opt to play this great card, which will actually increase its chances significantly to hit, which is Fire as She Bears, which is increase the number of combat dice for any one section by half. Now that would mean that instead of firing 5 cannons, for example, for its port broadside, it could its port forward broadside, it could make it 8 cannons because you always round up for halves. So this would add 3 shots to the Endymion. So the Endymion's going to play this card. However, the president can now reply with its own cards, and it actually has a great card in this case to stop that, because going from 5 cannons to 8 shots on one section would give the Endymion a potential of 13 instead of 10. That's bad, because that's probably going to add at least 1 or 2 more hits to the president, and we want to try to avoid that if we're the president. The president is going to play the card then, the best laid plans in response, which is immediately cancel the effects of a card just played by your opponent. So these 2 cards wash, and both cards are discarded. So now we're going to determine how many hits the Endymion gets on the president. We roll 1 die for each cannon that's firing. So the Endymion is firing 10 points worth of cannons, so it's going to roll 10 dice. It's going to be successful on a roll of 5 or greater, so a 5 or 6. And this is regardless of the range. The impact of range will come in when we try to negate hits on the president's roll. It's a second roll. So it's successful on a roll of 5 or greater. There are some die roll modifiers. The morale of the crew is a die roll modifier. So in this case, the Endymion is handy, which is +1. So we add 1 to the die roll, meaning that the Endymion needs a roll of 4, 5, or 6. And this is where you can see that morale is critical in ship performance here. Because if the Endymion's morale were fair, it would need 5s or 6s. If it were unfit, it would need a 6. So it gets really hard to hit your opponent as your morale starts to fall, which kind of goes back to the point I made in the in one of the previous videos, in that preserving your ship morale seems extremely important to me in order to kind of maintain your offensive capacity. So we're going to add 1 because its Endymion's morale is handy, so we would need a 4, 5, or 6. There's some ammunition modifiers. If we were firing double shot, it would be +1. If we were firing chain shot, it would also be +1. Now, if you're looking at the rule book, the chain shot says -1. The designer has made a modification to that, which says you can fire chain shot at +1. So that would make it a 3, 4, 5, or 6. Also, any bridge card play that were in here would come into play as well. But we've loaded the Endymion with round shot, so it's going to need 4, 5s, or 6s to hit. We're going to roll 10 dice. We'll do them in 2 batches of 5 because I don't have 10 dice. 4, 5, or 6 gets a hit for the Endymion. We get, oh my goodness, that's a devastating shot here. Everything, just move these out. That's a quality firing by the Endymion. Everything hits. 5 hits so far. This could be tough. And 1 on the second one, so we get 6 hits. I guess it's slightly above average overall. The second firing was pretty ineffective there. But the first one with all hits, so we have 6 hits coming in on the President. So now let's determine our defensive dice. So we know we've got 6 hits on the President coming in, but these are going to be reduced by this next little mini procedure. In order to determine the number of defensive dice that we're going to throw, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to determine a number of dice to throw, and if we have a successful throw, it's going to negate a hit that comes in for each one of those dice that we throw. So first up, we have to determine how many defensive dice are thrown. This is a pretty easy calculation. It's just the range divided by 2. So we know the range is 12, divided by 2 is 6. We're going to roll 6 defensive dice. There's a couple of other ways you can add defensive dice to this roll. One is if there's any smoke in either the firing square or the target square, or if a line of sight crosses any smoke in between the 2 ships. No ships have fired yet, so we don't have any smoke to deal with. And then also you could get, if a ship is on fire, that would add another die for either side. So if the firing ship or the target ship's on fire, we add 1 more die to this. But neither smoke nor on fire apply yet. So we're just doing our defensive dice of 6, which is the range divided by 2, rounded up. 12 divided by 2 is exactly 6. So we have 6 dice that we're going to be rolling as defensive dice. Now we have to roll them and determine how many of them are successful. So let's go to that part. On a defensive dice roll, we need to see successful to negate a hit. We need a 5 or greater. But there are some die roll modifiers, and one in particular in this case is a big one. First up, for the if the range is 12 or greater, we add 1 to the success to the die roll. So we need, instead of 5 or 6 to negate, for this one, because it's exactly 12, on a roll of a 4, 5, or 6, one of the hits will be negated. The other modifier to this is hull strength. So if the hull strength is firm, every time you roll a natural 1, the first time you roll a 1 in this die roll, you re-roll that particular die. So we're going to roll 6 dice, and we're going to look to see any time for each one that's a 1, we're going to re-roll it again to see if we can get a 4, 5, or 6 that's going to negate a hit. You only do that for the first time you roll that 1. If the hull were fragile, anytime you roll a 6, you re-roll half of them rounded up. So if we were to roll 1, 6 and had a fragile hull, we would re-roll one of those dies again to see if it actually negates the hit negation, if you would. Now, the President's hull is firm, so we're going to be looking for that natural 1, and we're going to re-roll those. We're going to roll 6 dice, and we're hoping for 4, 5s, or 6s from the President's perspective to be able to negate that hit. So let's go make that roll now. So here is our roll. We have 6, 6, 5, 5. So we have, in this case, 4 hit negations. Whoops, that was a 1. I just flipped it over by mistake. So we're also going to, because we have 1 natural 1, we're going to re-roll this number 1. So we know that we've negated 4 hits, but let's re-roll this 1 to see what happens. A 2, so it doesn't matter, and we don't do anything there with that one. So the President has successfully negated 4 of the 6 hits that have come into the ship, but, however, it's been hit 2 times. So let's calculate what happens next. Okay, so now that we know that the Endymion has hit the President twice, we have to determine where exactly on the ship these hits have registered. To do that, we're going to use the damage effects table. We can see here that we're going to have a number on a die roll on the right from 0 to 21. So we're rolling 3 dice to determine the effects. And then we cross-reference that with the number of hits achieved. So in this case, way over here on the left, we have 2 hits achieved. And now the greater the number doesn't indicate more damage. The way this works is that the higher the number, the higher the location on the ship that the firing hit. So if we look here, we see a 17, for example, would be 2 rigging hits, whereas a 3 would be 2 hull hits. So the higher the number, the higher up on the ship the damage is hit. So basically, if we get a big number, we're going to damage rigging. If we get a low number, we're going to damage the hull more. And if it's somewhere in between, you're going to kind of split the damage with the potential of damaging the crew, of adding crew casualties as well. We designated the Endymion to fire low early on. So we know that we're going to have some kind of a modifier to aim to kind of have the ship hit a little bit low. And there are some die roll modifiers to these three dice. Okay, this is a quick interruption from the future. I'm stepping back into this video to make a note that what's coming up in this next explanation has an error in it. Basically, I'm going to say that there's a -1 dice roll modifier when firing into the wind and a +1 dice roll modifier when firing with the wind. That, however, is incorrect. Now, I've fixed the graphics, and I'm making some notes how that would have impacted this combat, but basically undoing this would have taken probably about another hour or so, because it kind of hinges on how everything comes out in this whole firing example. So rather than fix that and correct it, I'm making note of it here. Now, the graphics you'll see are going to be correct, and I'll also make notes how it impacted the outcome of the combat here, this firing sequence. But just to state again, the correct version is -1 with the wind and +1 into the wind, and my voice is going to get this backwards in this upcoming segment. My apologies. Sorry. First is, if you're firing into the wind, it's -1, basically, so that's going to kind of naturally make the shot hit lower. And if you're firing with the wind, the shot's going to carry a little bit higher, so you're adding 1. The Endymion, because the wind is coming this way, the Endymion has the firing with the wind, so it's going to be +1 added to the die roll, whatever that die roll would be. And now we have to determine where the crew was aiming at. We know the Endymion again was aiming low, so we're going to look at the firing low die roll modifiers. And to do that, I want to kind of mention a little bit of a house rule that I've put into play. So firing low, if the crew morale is fair. Now, okay, so let's clarify a little bit. There was a little bit of a contradiction in the rules and on the damage effects table. On the damage effects table, it says +1 if you're firing low, it's -1 if the crew is handy, and +1 if the crew is unfit. The rules, however, say if you're firing low, you -1 if the crew is fair and -2 if the crew is handy. The designer has come out and said the damage effects table is the correct one. However, I'm using a house rule, which is using the basic rules from the rule book. So I'm actually kind of using the -1 if it's fair and -2 if it's handy. And the reason, it seems to give a little bit greater swing there, a little bit greater impact, and it also negates the possibility of just doing the opposite of what you want. Because if you're an unfit crew and you wanted to hit high, all you have to do is aim low and you get the same modifier. So I think it just feels kind of natural to kind of have the one that's in the rule book apply. So we're using that one. That's a long way to say it, that our firing low, we're going to use the crew morale is fair, it's -1. If it's handy, it's -2. So we're going to use the -2 for this case. If you're playing strictly by the rules, you would be using -1 because the crew is handy. So we have, in this case, we have -1 for the +1 for the wind because we're firing with the wind. We have -2 because the crew morale is handy. So in this case, we have a -1 to this die roll. So let's, after all that, this seems complicated, but once you do it a couple times, it's actually pretty fast. Let's roll now our 3 dice. Now we're going to have 1 die roll that's 2 of one color and 1 of another, and we want to note the singular die roll's result because that's going to be used for our morale check, which happens after this. So here's our 3 die rolls. We have a 6 and a 2, a 4, 2, 2, which is an 8, and we are subtracting 1, which gives us a 7. So we're going to cross-reference this, and we're going to note the blue die roll, which is a 2. We get a 7 going all the way across. We get 2 hull and 1 crew damage to the president. So let's go put that damage on the president. So now we're going to apply the damage to the president. We know it was 1 crew, so our crew goes down from 20 to 19. Now we have to apply the damage on the hull, and we have 2 hits to determine. There's a little bit of a process for determining which way this goes. We did decide that it was going to be the starboard side of the ship that was going to take its hit, and basically you're going to do this process where you divide them evenly on that side of the ship. So we have to distribute the hits evenly on the starboard side. Now if the starboard side, if one section were of greater strength than the other, that that's where you would start. So if, for example, this were the current situation for whatever reason, and the president had 6 capacity on its starboard forward and 7 capacity on its starboard aft, we would take the first hit on the starboard aft and then alternate after that. But that isn't the case now. Right now we see they're both at full capacity. So the defender picks the first place that gets hit. So we're going to it doesn't matter now because it's 2 hits. So we're going to take 1 off the starboard forward and we're going to take 1 off the starboard aft, reducing our hull by 2 hits. If we couldn't sustain all the damage on the starboard side, you would then move over to the port side and start applying the damage on the port side. This, of course, doesn't apply now because everything is there. So we can see now that the firing capacity on the starboard side of the president has been reduced from 6 cannons and 3 carronades to 5 cannons and 3 carronades for both sides. So it's gone from a fire capacity of 12 on its starboard side down to a firing capacity of 10. There could be some other modifiers that would adjust the hits, but none of them apply in this case. But just to kind of run through them so you can know what you're doing, what you're looking for here. If we had hit the rigging, because the president is at fighting sail, the rigging damage we divided by 2, rounded up, but we have no rigging damage, so there's nothing to modify there with that one. Likewise, if we had fired chain shot, all of the hull damage would be negated. There would be no hull damage whatsoever. You can't damage the hull with the chain shot. If it were a stern rake, you would modify the hull hits times 1.5 and round up. So instead of 2, would have been 3, and we would have applied 3 hits to the hull for the president. If you had fired double shot, again, you have an advantage to hit with double shot, but after you fire double shot, you have to roll 1 die for each section firing double shot. And on a resulting roll of 2 or less, the firing section, the Endymion in this case, would have suffered 1 hull hit. So potentially the Endymion could have had 2 hull hits on its own ship. The basic premise there is that firing double shot is dangerous for the cannons that are firing it. So we've applied now the damage to the president. The last thing we need to do is to check to see if this damage has impacted the president's morale at all. The next thing we need to do is to see if this damage has impacted the president's morale at all. To do this, we look at the morale effects table. And we see, we're going to cross-reference the odd die roll, which we had back, looking back on this, we saw that the odd die roll was the blue die, and that was a 2. And we're going to cross-reference that with the hits achieved on this morale effects table. We can see that the hits achieved were a 2, the die roll was a 2, so the resultant number is a 1. However, there's a modifier on this to determine, on the modifier on this before we kind of reference this, which is if the crew morale is handy, we add 1 to this die roll of the odd die. So basically the die roll then results in a 3, which is still here a 1. So that means this is the resultant number that shows up here is the number of dice you use to make your morale check. So we're going to have to make a morale check on the president's crew rolling 1 die. Let's go see what that involves. So a morale check is a fairly easy die roll. You're going to roll the indicated number of dice, in which case this is 1, and we're going to modify each die roll by crew morale. The president's morale right now is handy, so we're going to add a +1 to it. So that means we're going to roll and we add 1 to our die roll. If the result is a 2 or less, the crew fails the check and its morale decreases by 1 level. Because of that, we can see now that if it were 2 or less, we would have to roll a 1 for the president's morale to drop. But because the president's morale a drop in morale is so catastrophic, and early on this would greatly impact the outcome of the battle, the president is going to opt to play a card here, which is not for the event of adding 2 to each strike roll. It's just going to play discard to add +1 to any single die roll. So we're going to have a morale check with a +1 because the crew is currently handy, and a +1 because we're playing the card. So we're making a die roll with a +2, which means that there's no way it can fail it. We'll just roll it for fun. It got a 3, which is a 4, so it passes its morale check. I think this is actually a very good use of the cards because you do not want your morale to drop, and even on a chance of a 1 or a 6, that has such a huge impact on the outcome of on the president's capacity to return fire that we want to totally avoid that right now. So the morale check now is done. Let's go on now to check for fire. To check for fire, we're basically going to go reference the damage effects table again. We're going to use either the column footer or the column header. And the way this works is if the die roll, the resultant die roll was an 11 or greater, we're going to reference the column header, basically the blue and orange bar across the top that has the number of hits. And if it's a 10 or less, we're going to reference the column footer, which is the blue and orange boxes that run along the bottom of the chart for the amount of hits achieved. And basically you're looking for any one that has a red number in parentheses, and that would be how many dice you use to determine whether the ship has caught fire or not. Now we can see right now that the result was 2 hits, so there is no red number there on the lower, and we aimed low, firing low at the hull. So we can see that there is no red number there beside the 2. We'd have to get up to 4 hits before we would have a 1 there to make a die roll. So we do not check for fire. There is no possibility that the president would catch fire there. If we did have that, what we would do is for each number of dice there, we would make the roll, and any result of a 1 means that the ship has caught fire. So there's a small chance for those hit dice that the ship would catch fire. But in this case, nothing happened. The president is not on fire. It just suffered the crew and the hull damage. Lastly, what we need to do next is apply smoke. So let's go in and do that. Smoke is a really easy thing to apply. Basically, if you fired 3 or more dice per hit section, you add 2 smoke. So the Endymion here fired 5 cannons from its port forward, so +2, and it fired 5 cannons from its port aft, +2. So we drop 4 smoke markers onto the Endymion. Lastly, what we need to do now is to reload. So let's reload the ship. Just to make this a little bit more interesting, we're going to have the Endymion reload with double shot. Normally I wouldn't do this, but I want to kind of show how double shot would work. So we're going to have the Endymion reload with double shot. Now double shot or chain shot takes an additional 2 impulses to reload. So normally the Endymion with its crack crew would have 6 impulses to reload its round shot, but it's going to use double shot, so it's going to take 8. However, to disguise this, you take basically the double shot marker is fired there. It's the same. We're going to disguise it so our opponent doesn't know what we're doing. So we're going to flip these over and put the loaded here, and we put them on the 6 impulse turn. So it looks like we're going to be able to reload in 6 impulses. However, when we get there and we note that it's double shot, then we delay it 2 impulses, which is going to take it into the next turn, and then we turn it to the right. So right now we're just going to put them there, but when we flip them over and we show it's double shot, we add 2 impulses to it and we delay the reloading. So we're just going to see how that works. Normally I wouldn't do this because I kind of want the Endymion to fire again, but let's just see how it works from a mechanic perspective. That brings us to the end of this impulse. The president has fired its stern chasers. And by the way, stern chasers and forward chasers don't have smoke emit from them, so that's why we didn't put any on there. The president has successfully hit the rigging of the Endymion for 1 point. The Endymion has had a very successful broadside, hitting the president at range anyway, hitting the president for 2 hull points worth of damage and 1 crew damage. So both sides drawing blood. Now we will continue on to our turn activation and follow it along to see what the next impulse is. So we've finished that impulse. Now we're going to move through the impulses for the rest of the turn. 7, nothing happens. 8, 9, 10, 11, nothing happens. We come all the way over to impulse number 12, and we see that a lot is going on here. It's the last impulse in the turn. We've got both ships activating and both ships reloading, so there's going to be potential for more firing and also for more maneuvering. Let's start with the maneuvering because that's the first place we want to look. We're going to take these 2 activation markers over to the maneuver control panel and see what happens. Let's do the Endymion first. So it has its activation marker here. We know that its maneuver that it's chosen is advance across a corner. It's going to take 3 activations to do that. It has none stored up so far. So we're just going to drop this one on the used activation marker 1 for the Endymion to indicate that it's got 1 stored up. Once this gets to 3, we can execute this maneuver. So nothing happens for the Endymion right now. Likewise, the president is trying to perform a wear that's going to take 2 activations. It has no activations stored up as well. So we're just going to drop the president's activation down here 1. So now it's got 1 stored up. The next time the president gets an activation, it will have 2, which will allow it to complete that wear maneuver. Also, to recall from our last episode, because this is the end of the turn and both ships have in incomplete maneuvers, they were obligated to select the straining option when they selected those maneuvers. So both ships will be once again straining, and we'll talk about what that is at the end of the turn, because that happens once at the end of the complete turn. So even though we had both ships activate, neither ship were able to complete a maneuver. So the map and the board and the ocean is going to stay exactly the same position as we go to this next segment. Okay, so now it's time. We're at the reload impulse. Now we're at the reload section of the impulse. So we're going to the stern chasers here have been loaded by the president, so we'll drop those back on that stern chasers box on the ship mat. I'm just going to put them there. We can actually see them in the top left corner up here, but they are loaded back up. Now we have a different situation here with the Endymion, however, because its crack crew loads round shot in 6 impulses, as we've mentioned, but this is double shot. So it's not technically reloaded, but we've disguised it to our opponent, right? Who's thinking, oh, perhaps this is round shot, or it could be something else. So at this point in time, the Endymion would simply declare that, yep, I'm not loading, these are not fully loaded yet, and we're going to move them 1, 2, and put them up here and pay that penalty, which is 2 impulses later. So it carries over into the next turn. Now, to indicate that the penalty is paid, you flip the counter to the right 90 degrees, and that tells the game and everybody watching it that, okay, there's been a special kind of a reload, and that penalty is paid. Now, the designer did mention here, after kind of reviewing the first version of this video, that technically you could do the same thing with round shot to disguise round shot and just pay an extra 2 impulse penalty if, for whatever reason, that would make sense to do within the context of a 2-player game. But so basically in this case, though, however, they paid the 2 penalty. You flip the counters to the right. President probably assumes that something suspicious is up, but it doesn't know whether it's chain shot or whether it's double shot. Okay, so first of all, next up we have the determination of whether one ship's going to fire or not. But the Endymion is still loading, so it cannot fire with the only cannons that it could bring to bear on the president. So it will pass on this firing. The president, however, has reloaded its stern chasers. It is going to opt to fire its stern chasers. So once again, we're going to fire these stern chasers. We know the calculation already. It's basically just a rolling for a 6 to hit, and it has 2 to fire. So it's firing its stern chasers. The president gets a 1 and a 4, so no hits with the stern chasers, and the president has unsuccessfully fired. We will now move that. I'm not going to show this, but we're going to add 6 impulses to the reload for the stern chasers, so that will get dropped on impulse 6 of the next turn, because we just add 6 from where we are right now in this current turn. So the president's stern chasers will be reloaded in the 6th impulse of the next turn. We have now completed this impulse, and we've completed this turn. So now we're going to carry on to the end of turn sequences, the things that we do there. The first thing that happens at the end of the turn is what's called the bonus move phase, and this basically involves a straining maneuver. This is kind of a risky maneuver to try to increase the speed of your ship. There's 2 ways that a ship can make a straining maneuver. One is that it's required to make it because of the fact that during the turn it selected a maneuver that it couldn't complete on that turn. So in this case, both the president and the Endymion selected maneuvers that it couldn't complete during the turn. So it has to do a straining maneuver. Now, if this were optional, a ship can always decide to do this during this bonus move phase, in which case the non-initiative player decides first, and then the initiative player can decide after that. But right now, both ships have to do it. So let's see what this involves. The straining maneuver basically involves that a ship is going to move 1 square straight ahead. It can't wear after the move. It's just got to move straight ahead. And in order to successfully complete this maneuver, it has to roll a 6 or greater. But there's a lot of die roll modifiers. So let's take a look at those die roll modifiers now. First of all, the strength of the straining maneuver is added to the die roll. So in this case, both the president and the Endymion have selected a 2 straining maneuver, which is going to add +2 to the bonus movement die roll. So right now we're adding 2 to the die roll. The second modifier here is crew quality. Because both crews are crack, we're going to add 1 more to the die roll modifier. So we're adding +3 to both ships' maneuver. Now, the last modifier is whether you applied a points assigned to the sailing box on the ship mat. So let's just go take a quick look at that to kind of identify what we mean. So both the Endymion and the President have applied points assigned to this 1 point to sailing capacity of the ship. So both of these ships will get that +1 modifier. So to total up the modifiers, we have +1 for sailing. They're both identical, +1. Both ships selected the +2 straining maneuver, so it's +3. And the quality of the crew is crack for both ships, so it's +4. And again, we need a 6. So the only way this maneuver can fail is if the President or the Endymion rolls a 1. Now we could add a card to this to make it automatic, but we're not going to do that for each ship in this case because I think there are better uses right at the moment for the ship for these card uses. So let's go check this out and see what it means on the ship mat and how we're going to make these moves. So let's do the Endymion first. So to make this optional bonus move, we're going to move the smoke. The smoke stays where it is. It moves straight ahead. Now, even though in the maneuver chart, again, to mention this, it says the Endymion can complete this move at this bearing. It could wear one direction. Because it's a straining move, you don't have that option. So the smoke markers are going to stay behind it. The Endymion moves forward like this. Let's see if the Endymion is successful at this. We're adding 4 to the die roll. So the only way it would fail and incur damage on this if it were to roll a 1, and it has rolled a 2. 2 plus 4 is a 6. So the Endymion has successfully made this maneuver. Likewise, now let's take a look at the President. We're just going to shift a little bit here. The President's going to move straight ahead. So relatively speaking, this has changed the range a little bit here, but the President moves straight ahead. Likewise, the President would need a roll of a greater than a 1 to succeed. It gets a 1. Interesting. So the President has made the maneuver, but it's been unsuccessful, so it's going to suffer some damage. So let's take a look. The straining maneuver is explained here. There is one typo here that we want to note too, however. They've selected 2 strength straining maneuvers, and it says add 2 to the bonus maneuver. Failing the roll results in, even though this says 1 point, the rule book clarifies that because it's a 2-point straining maneuver, it's 2 points worth of rigging damage. If the President had selected a 1-point straining maneuver, adding 1 to its die roll, it would have resulted in 1 point of damage. So this is a typo. You want to make note of that. This is 2 points of damage. So the President has suffered 2 points of damage. Now we can clear these straining maneuvers off. They're done, so we'll put those back to the side. However, we need to go apply the damage to the President's rigging. So the President suffers 2 points of rigging damage, taking it down to 5. That was a costly maneuver for the President. President definitely getting the worst side of that turn. I mean, it lost a crew point, 2 points on its starboard hull, and 2 points of rigging with the failed straining maneuver. So President taking a beating here in the first turn. Advantage Endymion, which has only suffered the 1 point of rigging damage from the chasers, the stern chasers of the President. Let's continue on now to the end of turn housekeeping. Most of what we're going to do at the end of turn housekeeping is going to happen on these ship mats. So let's get started. First up, the first step is firefighting. Neither ship is on fire, so we're done with that. If it were on fire, you would make a die roll, and you modify it by crew quality. And if the modified result is a 5 or greater, the fire is extinguished. If it's a 3 or 4, nothing changes. If it's a 2 or less, the ship takes 1 additional hit of rigging damage. But no fires here, so we're done with that. Now let's go to damage control, because there are some things we can do here. So we're going to look for damage control. We have 2 points assigned. We'll do the President first. The President has put some damage control on its port forward broadsides, but there's no damage there, so that doesn't matter. However, it has damage control here, which applies to the rigging. So let's see what this might imply for the rolls here. So the President has 2 points applied to damage control, and the way this works is we're going to roll 1 die for each of these points assigned. So we're going to roll 2 dice, and we modify it by crew quality. So in this case, it's going to be crack +1, and any result of a 5 or higher repairs 1 rigging or hull box. Well, in this case, this is applied to the rigging, so it would be fixing the rigging. And we make this roll. However, one thing to note, it's 2 dice, but the most you can repair is 1 section. So it's not per die roll. It's if either die is a 4, 5, or 6 in this case, because we're modifying by crew quality, we're going to repair 1 section. If both dice were 4, 5, if both rolls were 4, 5, or 6, we still only repair 1 section. So let's see if we can repair this. We get a 4 and a 1, so we do successfully repair the rigging on the President. It goes from a 5 back up to a 6. So finally, the President's had something good happen. Let's do likewise. We can do take a look here at the Endymion damage control on here. The only place it would need damage control is on rigging, but it didn't apply any crew to the damage control for rigging, so it's going to stay where it is, and there's no damage control rolls for the Endymion. So next up, we'd have to do a morale check. And the morale check is done if for every section that's at a 0 on the hull, you roll 1 die for a morale check. And if the die roll is a 2 or less, you reduce the crew morale by 1 step, and that is modified by crew morale. So in this case, we don't have anything, right? It's zeros across the board, so there's no morale check for either the Endymion or the President because of hull damage. And that also is, well, just to make a note that even if you were to roll like 2 dice for 2 hull sections that were 0, the morale can only go down by 1 step. So it's either die fails, it goes down by 1 step. If both die fails, it still goes down by 1 step. Next up, we have to check for strike. To make a strike check, we're looking for any box that's in the strike check, and basically the 2 places this can happen is when the ship is completely demasted. So the President is getting closer to that, but not quite there. The crew here is, crew morale is still handy, so the crew morale could be there. This is basically the kind of end of game type of thing. Now, it's modified by crew morale, but you roll a die, and if you get a 1 or less, the ship strikes and the game is over. That particular ship surrenders. So once we get down here, we would roll a 1 modified by crew morale, roll a 1 die modified by crew morale. If we get a 1 or less, the President would strike its colors. So basically, if you get handy morale, you don't have to worry about that. But usually those things go hand in hand, and the morale is going to be a lot lower. So no strike checks to make for either ship. Next up, we could change our sail status on the ships here. So if we had points aside to rigging change, we could shift from fighting to medium or medium of fighting, providing that the condition of the ship allows it. So we have not applied points to either case here for the Endymion on the President. The President's in fighting sails, it could not make that change because it's restricted here to fighting sails only. The Endymion could have made that change, but it doesn't have any crew assigned to rigging change, so it's forced to stay at this current medium level right now, and that's where it's going to stay for a little bit. I think we're going to try to enjoy that advanced maneuverability that it's got right now over the President. So that is basically everything that happens with the change of the crew status and stuff. Now let's go and update smoke status. To update smoke, it's pretty easy. I've just moved the wind marker over here so it's easy to see. The smoke moves with the wind and it's reduced by 1. So these are currently at strength 2. We're going to make them strength 1. They move with the wind, so they cover the Endymion in smoke still a little bit, but they're at half the strength they were. The next turn, we will move them this direction, and they will fade away because they go from 1 to 0. So that's pretty easy to update smoke status. The last thing we need to do is to draw draw a bridge card. The initiative player only gets to draw a new bridge card, so the President will get this because it had the initiative in the last turn. We get perfect angle. When attacking, modify the damage effects die roll by +1 or -1, your choice. Okay, that could be helpful, but +1 or -1 isn't hugely significant on that chart. So this would be another card that might be a good one to save to modify some other die roll. But we'll add this to the President's hand. All right, so that brings us to the end of the first turn. The Endymion definitely getting the better of the President by scoring 1 crew hit, and then a rigging damage suffered when the President tried to strain, and 2 hits onto the hull. So a good start for the Endymion, as well as getting into a navigation position where it's going to be able to probably in the second turn, maybe the third turn, continue with some unanswered broadsides on the President. The President's in tricky straits because in the next turn it's going to maneuver away from the Endymion, exposing it again to its rear broadside, and probably not being able to get off any broadsides for a while. It's got to sort itself out and get itself reoriented so it can bring some of its cannons onto bear to the Endymion here. So a little bit of a tricky situation for the President as it struggles to navigate into a better position. The Endymion only suffering that 1 point of rigging damage. So far, after the first turn, advantage Endymion. Now, I had originally intended to continue these on and to make a third and fourth episode showing a little bit more of the continuation of the play. But both of these tutorials have become quite substantial, much longer than I envisioned, and I also stopped at various points to explain what would happen under certain circumstances, like morale checks and strike checks and things like that. So I feel like this set is, as it is pretty complete, and that I'm going to actually stop here rather than continue on to show more of this engagement. But the only thing we really didn't get to was melee. Other than that, I think we've covered almost everything that gets involved in terms of firing and maneuvering and all the different aspects of how the turn works. The only thing I will mention that's probably worth mentioning, that if the maneuvers had been of either ship had been successfully completed in that 12th impulse, you do not pick that next maneuver right away. If it's the 12th impulse, you wait until the beginning of the next turn when you select your next maneuver. So just like we did with that first turn, that's when it would happen in the sequence of play. That's the only thing really I don't think we've shown with the sequence of play that could be a little bit tricky to get there. But hopefully these two episodes have helped to clarify how to play and help people learn the game. So if you have any questions, let me know. And as always, I will make adjustments in a known errors section at the bottom in the description there. But thank you again for tuning in. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you're new, please consider subscribing. And we'll be back again with some more historical gaming and wargaming content on the channel soon. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye.